Go. We've got a few more joining. I might get started then. Once again, thanks to all that have joined us this Monday afternoon in what is the first of our Just Transition series, which will be happening all week. I'll share a bit more about that later. But I will I've got a few more people coming. Thank you. While we wait for a few more people to trickle in, I'll kick off. Firstly, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia that we are all joining from. And particularly, I join you today from Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So why this series? Why today? What are we doing here? So we are hosting a national webinar series this week that explores communities, benefits of renewable energy, the evolving role of local government, industry and communities in Australia's energy transition, and seeks to bring together industry leaders, practitioners, community advocates and others to share some insights about the transition to clean energy and communities' role in it, strengthen the collaboration between all those players working to support this transition, and most importantly, support better engagement practice that delivers improved community outcomes. I mean, why this series and why now? You know, Australia's energy transition is accelerating rapidly. We've been making steady progress over the last 20 odd years, but now is a time where this sense of urgency is great, and perhaps it's been a while since we've had the policy alignment across state governments, federal government, and local government to support the energy transition. But trust, consent, social acceptance is not guaranteed. And we need to see communities not as a barrier to overcome, but partners in shaping the outcomes of this energy transition. The role of engagement in that is significant. Some might see engagement as risk mitigation, others as opportunity creation. But what we do know is if it's done well, it can lead to better projects. It supports stronger communities, and it supports more durable outcomes and shared benefits for all. What participants can expect to see this week is a series of broad-ranging conversations that include sort of practical lessons, honest conversations and shared perspectives from the various people that will be participating this week, and interactive sessions that are also designed to help us sort of learn from each other and share those learnings, but also look at what are some practical solutions that we can explore to help make this transition and communities' role in it an easier one, hopefully. Today's session, and I'll go through at the end of the session today just what some of those other conversations that we're having today and who's speaking at those. So you'll be able to see in a little bit more detail what the conversations are and who's speaking when. But please sign up if you haven't already to those that interest you and share with others that you think it may be relevant for. But today's session is really about just kicking things off and starting to get that conversation happening. Today's format will be a conversation with myself and my wonderful guests. We'll explore a few themes in our discussion, but importantly, we'll leave some time at the end as well for you to provide any questions or ask any questions that you may have. So look out for that later in the session today. But as we're talking, if there is something that comes to mind, please use the Q&A function in the bottom of the screen. Hopefully that is there for all of you, and we can get to those at the end. But first, I will introduce the wonderful people that are part of this discussion today. So firstly, we have Dr. Liz Young, who is the Research Director with the Queensland Decarbonisation Hub at the University of Queensland Centre for Policy Futures. So Liz's work focuses on energy and climate transitions, sectoral decarbonisation and policy innovation. And before joining UQ, Liz actually spent about 20 years in the Queensland government in various senior leadership roles, helping to shape climate and environmental policy. She's played a really key role in some major initiatives such as the Clean Economy Jobs Bill and the introduction of bioregional planning and protected area reforms. She's passionate about bridging research and policy to drive systemic change, and we're really excited, Liz, to have you as part of this conversation today and sharing some of those broad perspectives that you have. I'm also joined by Kate Gilchrist, who's Executive Director for Energy Transformation at RSK Australia. So Kate brings decades of experience delivering major infrastructure projects across multiple sectors. She brings diverse points of view as both the board member, company director, business director, project manager, construction engineer, and community member. She's lived and worked in rural and urban Australia, as well as international capitals like London and Dublin. And she's driven to commit her work and practice to things that help make the world a better place, solving some of those big problems and challenges, and believes in the power of bringing people together, knowing that what we can't imagine is what we can collectively achieve. And Kate's supported some big community conversations and some big project deliveries that have really changed the shape of people's communities. She's done that across many sectors, including the transport sector, and now is putting her passion and energy into energy transformation with RSK Australia. So thanks for joining us, Kate. And last but not least, I'm joined by Phil Byrne, who's the Head of Development at Virya Energy. So Phil is an experienced leader who's provided strategic leadership to teams within the energy, government and consulting sectors. So certainly understands the various perspectives that we were talking about today from an energy transition perspective. Phil is currently Head of Development at Virya Energy, a small Australian renewable energy generation and storage company with big plans for Victoria's energy transmission. Prior to his current role, Phil was an executive in Victoria's Department of Transport and Planning, responsible for reforming Victoria's planning and building systems. He's also a former chair of the Clean Energy Council's Wind Energy Directorate and a former board member of the Australian Wind Alliance, which is now Realliance. So we have a great group of people for us to start this conversation, and I'm going to kick off by actually asking each of you, what does a just energy transition mean from your perspective? And Liz, I might start with you. What does a just transition mean to you?
Thanks for the question, Sandra. I think it's a really important question, and we did have a bit of a chit chat last week. So I was aware that something about this sort of question was going to come my way. And I guess one of the things that I really started thinking about is, what does just really mean, particularly in the context of a transition? So if we accept the idea that what we're looking at is the most significant economic transition in our time and probably in the last century, and then reframe that in terms of, so what outcome in that context would look just? And then I took another step back, and now I'm an academic. I'm allowed to do these steps back and forwards. I don't have to be pragmatic all the time. And I thought about one of the missing things I think we often forget to talk about is the power interaction that occurs through the transition. So who gets what, why, how, and where, and really thinking deeply about what that means for the communities that are impacted. So a just transition for me really comes back to making sure that if you were to compare the beginning to the end of the journey, whatever the steps look like, that what we're really doing is genuinely ensuring that the benefits and the power relationships that emerge as we sort of interact over these things, that there is an equitable distribution of the benefits and also the challenges that come with it. So if you're going to benefit, then you're a participant. And so I think for me, as I thought more and more about it, like a just transition means that we're keeping that with us and that we don't get quite as distracted by the technical and process and the bits of it, that we're really going back to who are the people that are impacted and how do we make sure that the benefits are shared across all of those people in the community. So that's kind of where I would start.
Thanks, Liz. That's a thoughtful contribution. There's some threads there that I'm looking forward to picking up as we're talking more today. Um, Kate, what about you? What does the energy transition mean from your
Hmm.
perspective?
Yeah, I think I did a bit the same as Liz, and I definitely came back to the word just. Like, what does that mean? And I, so to me, and a lot of the people I talk to, if you talk about just and justice, it's about fairness. And what's fair and reasonable, and we're a smart, educated country with smart, educated people that are in it and contribute to it and live in it, and whether that's technically or providing money or policy or whatever that might be. But it's that concept that we need to be fair. Fairness is different for you, for me, for the people on this call, and just being aware of that fairness through different eyes is different, but also understanding that if we can take people on a fairness journey, which is with all things considered, be that the technical, the planet, the people, the money, the developers, the biggest transformation in our electrical system, ever since it got started, and tell people the fairness story, then the smart, intelligent people that we have throughout this industry will understand that. And we shouldn't, ever insult anyone's intelligence around that, and just but take people on that fairness story about this is fair because of X, Y, Z. Things change along the way, so fairness changes as well. But I think that concept of fairness is important. The other word for me, and I went through a bit of deep thought around this, and some people will say, why did you bother so much about that? But even when you read out my title, Sandra, like the Executive Director of Energy Transformation, it's intentionally not transition, because it's kind of acknowledging that, transition can kind of feel just from here to here, whereas transformation is that it's deep, it's wide, there's lots of different parts to it, and it is transforming. And I personally feel that feels a bit more optimistic as well, transformation rather than transition. Maybe that's just me. So I think there's a bit there around language matters, but yeah, so the concept of just is about fairness, respect that looks different for different people, and take people on that journey.
Well, thanks, Kate, and we'll be rebranding this the Just Transformation series shortly. Phil, tell me your perspective on this idea of the just transition. Now, we've got research perspectives, a sort of a management and a consultant perspective, and you're sitting there in the developer shoes at the moment. What's a just transition mean to you?
Well, I certainly wouldn't disagree with any of the points that have been raised. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a couple of things. I mean, really for me, it's just that we have a transition, and I do like that that sort of term of more transformation, because it's a bit more reflective of the scale of change. So I do really like that term, but really just to ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind, and that we have the benefits that come with this change that are maximised for everyone. And if you look back at some of these other big changes that have happened, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the scramble for oil and those sorts of things, I think you look back on those and you think, well, it'd be hard to argue that they've been just. Certainly haven't been intergenerationally just. That's for sure. And I think if you look at, say, AI and where some of that's heading, and a lot of that's still in the hands of few. So that sort of concerns me as well. But I think with renewables, is what you've got is a significant opportunity that you don't get elsewhere, and it's an opportunity that just goes beyond providing clean energy and replacing fossil fuels and having that sort of immediate employment. But I think if you look at it in terms of a transformational change, then there's benefits that really do can really be shared if we're smart. And I think we also need to be mindful that other people need to step in and assist in this process as well. And I've been incredibly frustrated over the last, just as an example of something that's not just, of around this sort of discussion around where we've really done a lot of work in, say, supporting rooftop solar, and now we're sort of supporting rooftop batteries, whether it's EVs and all these sorts of things, and just how we've even sort of come this far. And there's arguments around that's the fault of the technology because it's making the prices go up for others and those sorts of things, when really there's other mechanisms that we can pull now if we wanted to, that could have fixed power prices and all sorts of things that could ensure that that, say, vulnerable people and users of electricity could have those concerns dealt with about increasing prices during this period of change, as transmissions being rolled out and some of these other schemes. So we've got a lot of these things that we can do immediately to ensure things are just. But a lot of it also goes into the realm of policymakers as well as an industry sector.
Some really thoughtful contributions there from all three of you. And for those that are listening, I promise you that we don't just have a whole session of Dorothy Dix's, like there was a couple of thought conversations. But one of the things we really wanted to do today is just to sort of pick up on some of the threads of this discussion and follow those down a few rabbit holes. And I want to, Liz, Kate, you've both mentioned fairness. Phil, you've also spoken rightly about the role actually that already communities, whether it may be one household at a time, have made to support the energy transition so far with rooftop solar and the likes. But in this fairness story, something that consistently comes up for those who are working in the space daily and those who are observing is a sense of a lack of fairness, perhaps, is shared by some, from the regional versus urban divide. What does fairness look like in that context? How do we support the perception of what's fair for those that might be connecting with the transition in ways that look very different? So if you're in a regional area that has a very necessary but very complex and not very attractive transmission line that needs to go through your area to support generation, your experience of this transition is different to the person in the metropolitan area who perhaps has put rooftop solar on and are doing their bit, but they're not getting the rebates they once did, or it's still expensive to put a battery on, or whatever it might be. What does this look like? What does fairness look like in the context of regional Australia versus urban Australian communities?
I'm happy to jump in there. So from my experience in this space is you just keep talking about the why it's fair to the people and hear the response back. So for example, around why it's going to make people's lives easier, why it's going to help them save money, why it's going to help them get from A to B quicker, why is it going to help their agricultural land in the future because of X, Y, Z? Why is it going to help the local coal workers that might feel like they don't know what job is going to be for them in the next 5 years, but this is about transforming their skills and their knowledge and increasing that. So that keep asking the why question around like why it's going to be beneficial, and listen to what comes back, because what we might think is the why it makes sense for a rural community might not be what they think is. And our rural communities are very diverse from weather, industry, people, history, connection, all those different things. So I think that spending the time and not having a cookie cutter approach is really important, and I guess I would, challenge us around, while it might feel different rurally and urban, like how, like why? What is that? Like what is the difference? There's some obvious ones, but like not assume some things either as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Liz. Kate, sorry, it's understanding each community is unique, and the factors that influence their perspectives or their fears or their aspirations is unique, and we need to do the work to understand what are those communities and listen to what they're telling us in response to that story of fairness. Liz, I think you've popped yourself on mute, so I take that as a sign.
No, I was just taking myself off mute because I was about to say something because I thought you were about to stop. I'm sort of happy to jump in there as well, because I think it's very easy to assume that fairness is simple, and it's not. So we need to just acknowledge straight up that while fairness is a great aspiration, it comes with an enormous amount of complexity. And one of the lenses of that complexity is the urban regional divide. But what we'll find is, as with any other issue, people that are typically disadvantaged in any particular situation are the ones most vulnerable to be disadvantaged through any change, unless you are really aware of it. I personally believe, and this is probably putting on like I was in government for a really long time, and I do think that state and Commonwealth governments have an enormous responsibility to provide that oversight and structure to ensure that groups that are going to be particularly disadvantaged are not, and that's where they need to step in. And sometimes that, and I think going back to Kate's comment, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to what that stepping in is. And I think the most critical point is when governments actually acknowledge that they do have that role. So it's not necessarily what they do, but they have a responsibility to do something. So, and that's at both the state and the Commonwealth level. Given the kind of funding that local governments do, I think local governments then operationalise that and are able to then do things in their local setting. But until governments really say it's like with anything, like with whether it's wages or access to education or any of those other key fundamental things, and your relationship to the energy system in this day and age is basically a fundamental component of your standard of living. And so governments historically, when that linkage has been made, have accepted some form of responsibility and responsibility to equalise when there is unfairness. And so my feeling is that shifting from this sort of view where, oh, this is about a rural urban divide, and now we'll make it all political and we won't accept responsibility and there'll be a bit of mud that we'll keep throwing at each other, doesn't help. And if governments can sort of make that shift and accept that responsibility and then move on from that and then put in place, do their role properly, I think that will make a significant difference.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, you're touching on that theme as well around sort of equity and inclusion, and Bill, you might have a view on this as well. But what voices do you feel or do you see through your work are most missing from these energy conversations, and is there anything we can practically do to bring those voices into this transformation, if you will?
Sure, no, and I think that's a good point in terms of what's missing. And it's not, what people pay for their power is obviously broader than what I do in my role. And I touched on how, some really straightforward policy settings could go and deal with that inequity as a starting point. I think it's really important that the narrative is there, and who tells the narrative is really important as well. And I think that's to touching on those why points that Kate ran through before, and really just bringing people along for the journey. And I think, and I actually think a lot of the Vic grid work that was done in Victoria, as an example, is some pretty good work, and I can come back to why on that. But I think in in terms of who's traditionally missed out and where we need to be very careful of ensuring that they are very part of this is First Peoples and how projects are happening on country. And one of the frustrating things here when you deal with where you're engaging with another stakeholder is they might remind you that they're a sixth or seventh generation farmer. And when I hear that, I just think it's interesting that they've got that, connection and everything. But, they're probably, they're not far off from, getting the farm from for nothing and having it sort of given into, stolen via a government and then given it to them. So I think if you look at that sort of that element of it as well, I think it's a really interesting dynamic, but certainly in a Victorian context as well. I mean, with treaty and I think those sorts of things. I think that's a space that is really important because we've got we're coming from such a unequitable start in all of those discussions. So I think that that's I guess an area where I think where everyone needs to do a lot better.
Yep. I think it's a great point, and so we're having there's a session on Wednesday which looks at Indigenous leadership and role of Indigenous peoples in the energy transmission, which hopefully will explore some of that a little bit further. Liz or Kate, what's your view on the voices that are often missing from these conversations and how we bring them in?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things that have sprung to mind, just think about that, is the expertise and knowledge that is actually in the areas where these projects are happening. So I mentioned before around you've got a whole industry in some areas that have worked in mining. So are out in the regions, you've got technical knowledge, you've got land understanding, you've got flooding and drainage knowledge, you've got rock and geology knowledge. I could keep going. You've got mechanical, you've got electrical. There's so much knowledge in our country where these projects are happening. Sure, that might have been applied in a different place. But how can we use that, draw on it, transform it, lean on it to see what we can use in that space, and history will tell us that's what we've done before. We've had numerous things that have changed. The other thing for me is just the international knowledge as well. Like Australia is where it is in its energy transformation, and we are behind a lot of other developed countries around where we need to get to. So, beg, steal, borrow, there's lots of international experience. Sure, you need to apply it and make it make sense in Australia. But I'd like to see us tap more into international experience that's already there that we can leverage, use, and in particular the things that haven't worked. So drawing on that would be a good voice.
Yeah, Kate, I think it's interesting. You sort of spoke to the amount of technical knowledge that exists within communities, and you mentioned mining, and in each geography, there's different prevailing industries that might have existed in an area that are seeing. We know in Victoria and Gippsland, it's the whole generations of families working in coal mining, and that's or coal generation, and that's shifting. Other communities across Queensland, WA, who have a strong history working in mining, and that's shifting. And I think that often it's sort of pitched as either or, like you're either supporting coal or gas or other technologies or renewables, and perhaps the bridge between getting people with that knowledge and experience to participate effectively in these conversations is a little bit blocked because of an ideology or just a narrative that exists, about it's either clean energy or the other. Do do you find, and have you found in the spaces that you have worked, that it's difficult to get people from different industries to participate in that way, or is it about, as you said earlier, just kind of reframing the story a little bit?
Not generally. I think once you open the door, it's amazing what comes out sometimes. So it's just like dropping some of those assumptions and asking the question around how people would like to contribute.
Yeah. Excellent. Liz, I'm interested in your work that you're doing at UQ, and maybe you could provide a little bit of an overview for those listening about it, and how that connects to the conversation that we're having today, and some of these challenges around supporting community outcomes and voices in the process.
Sure. So the hub was initially established as a way in which university sort of research could better support industry, government, and communities, I guess, navigate the transition or the transformation, as we're going to call it from here on. And so the idea of the hub was that it represents all 7 universities in Queensland, and the idea of sort of this knowledge brokerage and knowledge translation was a key part of it. And I think I'll just talk about the translation piece, because I think one of the key challenges that we have is that the way that knowledge is around this area is currently set up is that it quite often is very much expert based. And I've had a few different jobs in government over time, and I always started off as not being an expert. And I always cherished those moments where I didn't understand things, because it gave me greater insight in terms of how it is that when we talk about something, someone who isn't living and breathing this stuff is going to understand it. And it's very easy when you sort of spend, like I've been sort of doing this stuff for about 4 or 5 years now, and I can drop terms like mitigation, adaptation, even some really basic concepts that when I first started in this space, like didn't automatically understand. And I think one of the key challenges is to make sure that without being paternalistic, we keep things accessible. And so there's a lot of things that are going on out there that are experts. It's kind of easier when you can drop a whole lot of terms. And I've done it a few times as well. When someone's been really confrontational, I go, well, I'm just going to outword you. And I'll use a whole lot of long terms so I do know what they mean to sort of, shore up my position. But that's not how you get information accessible to people. And if information about what's going on is hard to access and understand, and that there's barriers to that, then that's one of the key challenges, I think, in terms of making sure that this is something that's being done with people instead of to people. Because if you can't understand what's going on, you certainly can't have an opinion that's, well informed about what it is that you'd like to achieve out of that. And so the key sort of projects that we're doing in the hub, I mean, my general ethos is to go and say, how can I help? What is it that you would like to understand? And then look at how we can support that process. And that's been the underpinnings of some work with Queensland Farmers Federation, where we started saying, well, what kind of future would farmers like in a net zero world, for example? Or what kind of future, where do you see yourself in all of this? And I think unpacking those conversations, but coming on the terms of the people that are receiving the information rather than us that are giving the information, is a really important starting point, because that's when you get the empathy as well. So, for example, for those people that have been in the coal mining industry all their lives, if you engage at a rhetorical level with people that are in that industry, then it becomes very black and white, and it's easy to demonize. When in fact, these are people that have worked hard in a job that has had value and relevance, and for some time into the future we'll still have that, but it's changing. So how do we have a mature conversation with those people and allow them to start making some choices about the changes that are happening? And I think that's a really important part of this, that it's easy for us to forget, because we sit in this sort of place where it's our normal conversation piece. And so that's one of the shifts that I guess in my job at the moment that I see as the key priority for me, and also to remember to do it, because it's easy to forget to do it at times.
Yeah, I think that's a really, how can I help? What is it that you'd like to understand? I mean, they're really basic questions, but they shift the conversation to something else. And you talked about working with Farmers Federation about what does that future look like for you. I think that framing is pushing it to not. It's not about the widgets, like this is what we need to do. This is for this, but it's about what does this look like, and re recontextualizing what that conversation is. It's looking at outcomes, it's looking at the future, and it in doing that, understanding, at each level, the things that are important to people.
And I think people who are part of the transformation are sitting there looking at how important it is. I don't know if the term guilty is exactly right, but it's almost like we worry about the fact that this is something that we can see coming and other people aren't. And I think there was a bit in Australia, the buy-in in terms of the contested politics didn't help. When I talk about the energy transition to people, I say it's not about what I want, it's what's happening globally. And it doesn't matter. It might not happen quite as quickly. It might happen a bit more slowly, or it might happen a lot faster, and I can't control that. But the key thing is, how do we make sure that as these things unfold, you're in a position to make decisions about your future? So let's talk about what is going on in a way that you can understand. So that then positions you to make the decisions. And you might make the decision that you don't want anything to do with it, and that you're going to hold on to your belief that coal, for example, is the future for Australia. And we've got to respect that once given information, some people will want that. But most people will go, well, there are changes. So what's the future I want for myself, and what's the future I want for my kids? And I think the climate change layer also is, if we don't start thinking about this now, then the future for future generations is going to be more constrained. So the earlier we act, the more choices we have, rather than I'm going to tell you how you should respond to these things.
Mm. And Liz, like, what do you, and from the research that you're doing and the conversations that you're having, like, what responsibility does industry, government, practitioners, what do we each hold in this
So
discussion?
my view is that for each of those groups, when you look at, so for industry, an industry can't really be put in the same, like there's lots of different industries, and some will bet there'll be winners and losers, and there are always winners and losers in change. But industry in general will win when it looks at what the horizon is going to bring and it adapts early. Exactly how it adapts will be bespoke to individual industries and individual contexts, but really that understanding of the many different forces that are sort of shifting. For communities, it's about, and I think this sort of comes back then to the role of local governments, it's about starting to have those conversations about what it is that we need to know at the local government level that can support our communities. Because there's this massive data gap. Like the Australian government at the moment has the most beautiful data that it collects. And I'm a bit of a data geek, I love it, that they collected for the first pass risk assessment that they did last year. And it actually goes to local government level, and it tells a whole story about what's going to be happening on the ground over the next 20 years physically in various places. But local governments often find that the way in which the data is presented is inaccessible to them. And then because they don't really know what's going on, and that makes people afraid, they sort of back off rather than saying, how can we have conversations about understanding this better? And so I don't prescribe anything to anyone except to encourage people to try and break down some of those information flows. And that my experience is that once people can get a better sense and understanding, and once they can feel like they have some agency, then that's when the shift and the empowerment can actually happen, regardless of whatever else is going on. So some of this isn't going to be great. I personally believe that some of the things that are going to happen with climate change are not going to be fun, and we have some little disasters every now and then that remind us of that. But there's a massive difference when you feel like you're a victim in all of that compared to when you've been given some agency and you're making choices. And so I'm choosing to stay on my farm. I'm choosing the crops that I'm going to grow. I'm choosing what I'm going to do, compared to all this stuff is just coming at me and now I'm a victim. And I think that's part of the shift, at least.
Mm. Yeah, that's very eloquently put. And Phil, I'm sort of curious from your perspective. Um, you obviously, you've had experience working in a planning context. You've got experience working from a project development perspective. What do you see as the sort of the responsibility of those different roles in supporting shifting shifting the conversation and helping communities be a more engaged part of shaping the outcomes of these projects? Do you have experience sort of seeing those things intersect, collide? What's your
Look, I think
perspective?
it's a really good question, and the context of the who and the specifics of a community are critical as well, but the role is also critical as well. Developers that are taking um, a development project through a process and then on through to construction and operation, they've got a very different role in this, say, to compared to um, government. And to be honest, government's only just rolled up.
Mm,
In terms of what governments are doing now with some of their renewable energy zone work, that really strategic look at where things are going to go, and then sort of tapping into the communities and saying, we've got to do this. Here's what we found, basically, off our sort of the information that we've got. What else can you tell us about this area? What are the areas that are important to you, and those sorts of things? And that's and that when that's supported with some of those really good tools like the interactive maps and the work that agencies have done on the ground. Like that is, I actually find that really good work. And in any event, there was no work being done on that, 3 years before. That's a 3-year-old, 4-year-old thing. Zero was happening. That was um, all on industry essentially. And then I think groups like RE Alliance as well are established now to help have those conversations with communities that are not a government voice. They're not a mouthpiece for the government. They're not a mouthpiece for the developers, but they can start to have some of those conversations about what the future might look in some of this space. So so very different roles and very different responsibilities. But the one thing that's unique is that when things go wrong or don't go as well as they could, it doesn't matter. You're all in the same bucket. Transition bucket. Like if government does something poorly, then everyone suffers. If one sector within the renewable energy industry does something poorly, then everyone suffers. The contractor of a contractor gets something wrong, and then that's an impact. So how we kind of work through all of those issues are pretty important. But I think the other thing is that we also need to be mindful of a couple of things. Some of the commercial realities as well of projects. We do have an open. We've got the SEC is back in Victoria, but it's not the SEC of old. It's been opened up for private market participants, and that's what's happening. And there's there are in terms of impacts of projects and impacts of the transitions, they are different for different groups. And for the most part, people in sort of regional areas can get very concerned about power lines and those sorts of things because they're new and they're different and everything else. But here, that's kind of where a lot of our kids play Saturday sport under such power lines as they sort of go through the suburbs and into the country. So bringing people along for that story and just being mindful of the roles that the various entities have to play, and such as government and industry, but also let's not discount that there are bad actors out there. that make things very difficult. And even those entities, they've got a duty of care, like that. This transition will come. The economics, the physics point to that. It'll just be a matter of how fast that happens. But once we sort of through the first bit of it, we need to, collectively, everyone needs to make sure that we're not leaving behind a mess, or we're not leaving behind damaged relationships and communities that have difficulties engaging with each other going forward. So we really need to be very, very careful in that space, and that's a really hard thing when you've got a few bad actors thrown in the mix in this space as well.
Yeah, Phil, I think that's a really good point. In many ways, myself have worked in this industry for nearly 20 years, and I don't think, as I sort of signaled at the start, I think it's probably one of the best times in terms of there being a really strong alignment between the industry and government going, or actually we are kind of in this together. It's no longer just government's just the approving body. They're also helping to develop a lot of the infrastructure that's needed to make it happen, or in the case of SEC, in some ways, getting into generation again. And it's not as black and white as it once was. But yeah, the flip side of that is that reputation matters, and it's lifting the standard and setting an expectation of what is good engagement, and I think we're seeing more of that being hard coded into approval processes and the like, which is a good thing. But there's still a challenge around any community's perception of whether or not you're here for good reasons or bad reasons might be shaped by their experiences with the past, whether it might be other renewable developers or just development in general. And it's an important context piece for the launch pad of engaging and having good conversations about this with particular affected communities. Phil, when we talk about government, and we've got a session later in the week as well about the role of local government. What does that look like? What does that look like on the ground? I know this looks different in different states where some of the policy setting is different, but are local governments a passenger, or are they driving, or what's the role of local government in terms of this supporting these improved social outcomes and navigating these at times difficult conversations about energy transition?
Yeah, it depends, and it's a very big depends, and it does vary quite a fair bit with some of the the statutory arrangements across states and so forth. I think if you looked at things like planning processes and those sorts of things, you'd sort of feel that local government's increasingly being sort of left out a little bit, and that's an understandable, I guess, view to hold, because there has been changes in the years over all of that. But I think local government's views in terms of what they contribute to planning and assessment processes are critical. What they contribute to other sorts of various like tender processes as they come up over the years as well. But I think in the most part, when there's local governments that see the opportunity in transition, they are really setting their communities up, I think, for success in the future. And I think that's, I think if you've got, you want local government to be vocal, you want local governments to ensure standards are applied and the communities that they represent are engaged with and consulted and those sorts of things. But if they also, on top of that, see the benefits of transition and then what that might mean further down the track, beyond the workforce, but into that sort of space of cheaper power and more diverse regional communities and those sorts of things. I think that's when you're really forward thinking, that can be very, very successful.
Yeah. Liz, are you hearing from local government in your research and in your work?
So I'm fortunate enough to be on the Local Government Association of Queensland's expert panel
Right.
on climate. It's mostly climate, but a bit of energy transition. So I'm now an
I'm glad I
expert.
asked you.
Yeah. I think Queensland local governments are a bit unique in that typically they have more responsibility than local governments Australia-wide. And I don't know every local government kind of complex, but I grew up in South Australia where local governments were certainly service delivery providers, but they didn't do much more. Whereas in Queensland, they have quite significant responsibilities through planning. I think part of the challenge that we have is that the sort of processes that we're talking about have traditionally been managed through regulatory processes, like sort of your EPA type things. So you want to build something, then you have to tick lots of boxes. And local governments haven't had a significant role generally in the box ticking process at a state government level. We do regional planning, but those regional plannings, the aspirations in the early 2000s for what regional planning might mean, I think haven't really been realised. And so if you were to do regional planning right, you might actually see quite a significant capacity for local governments. But I know that in Queensland, local governments are starting to also look at how they can work together to manage these issues. So, for example, in the Central West, there's the RAPID group. And if you ask me what that stands for, I won't be able to remember online, but it's 5 councils that actually work together. And part of the key things that they're dealing with is what the energy transition looks like for them. And so I think the model of individual local governments dealing with things, I think, is probably a bit challenging for them and their capacity. But I think when they group together, especially because the regional ones, like you've got some pretty small councils in remote Queensland, right? And they're just sort of at their full stretch, just trying to do the basics with the kind of resourcing that they get. But if you combine 5 or 6 of them together and they look at their region collectively, and usually these issues have a regional quality, then I think my view is that empowering local, one of the reasons why I'm on this expert panel is because I have a very strong commitment to local governments. I think that they're underused in the Australian system, and like go back, I did politics way back when, and sometimes I think the states actually pick up way too much in between and are trying to do things. And in a state like Queensland, which is as big as it is, the ability for someone in Brisbane to understand what it's like on the Cape is absolutely zero unless they're visiting there. And there's no way that politicians, it's the same with the Canberra kind of problem. There's no way that they can do their job and be travelling around the countryside all the time and coming back. So I think in terms of managing what communities want and being able to articulate that, my view is that strengthening the capacity and the role of local governments together is critical.
Yeah, that's great. I've got to, thanks. There's some questions starting to come through in the chat, so I'll get to those shortly as well, but we'll touch on that theme again. I'm just going to shift gears for a second, but like I want to, as we're starting to, the time's just escaping, there's so much to talk about. But I'm keen to, before we get to sort of questions from those online, I'm keen to sort of just draw on some of your own experiences, lessons learned, examples, whether from renewables or other industries, around what that meaningful community participation looks like in practice. Where have you seen that work well, or where have you seen it not work well? What are some of the sort of the practical things we can start to learn from in terms of meaningful participation from communities? Kate, you've been here in many sectors and in many spaces. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, something that came to me just hearing other people speak was a bit of coming back to the fundamental about what are people's roles? Like, what is the role of federal government, state government, local government, industry, international, technical, futurist, all the different, and really not assuming what that is and taking the time to really understand that, and that changes as things go along as well. The other thing I'll just say out loud, so it's said, our local councils need more money, fundamental, if they're such a huge part of it. So that's important. I think the things that work is, and I mentioned money there, is we just got to understand the money. So where is it coming from? It is different in energy transformation, because you do have private money from developers and and different parts of industry, like understanding where that is, how it's funded, how those decisions are made, how quickly they can happen, how quickly they don't happen, what does the return on investment for that money look like, and that looks different for levels of government, for manufacturers, for developers. So that real, and not shying away from having the money conversation around, like, where is it, who uses it. The piece, as I mentioned earlier, about just keep asking the question about why this is beneficial to wherever you are. Like, why is this going to save people money? Why is it going to help their property? Why is it going to help their corner store? Why is it going to help their animals, their family, their community, their beliefs? Really works. This isn't a new thing, but it's just spending the time up front doing the planning. Like, spend the time, bring the people in. If you spend more effort doing the thinking and the planning, the delivery will happen. The other thing I've seen, when it's done well, is the real lessons learned process. That real, that didn't go as we thought. Okay, who do we need in a room to go, like, root cause? Was it this? Was it this? And spending the time to go, okay, we're not going to do that next time. We're going to change it to that. And that can look very different as well. And that can be a half an hour piece of work, or it can be a 2-week piece of work, depending on what it is. And coming back to the, where we started a bit around the concept of just, is this, again, the fairness thing around, okay, does this feel fair and reasonable? I do like the concept of the pub test. That doesn't land with everybody, but I think that concept of, if you asked a group of people generally how this would feel, what would they say? And that'll change as it goes along. But the big one for me that is celebrating success. That's been probably one of the biggest things I've seen, is around telling the good news story, how this has helped, how something actually went better than we thought as well. That real, and whether that's for community, for people, for developers, for government, whoever, whatever lens, the more of that. And what can we learn from those positive, inspiring, and sometimes positive things come out when you weren't expecting them either. So that's a bit of fun, and being able to share that as well is really important.
Yeah, Kate, that I was just last week reading an article in the Victorian papers about one of the level crossing removal locations from 10 years ago, and it was a bit of, there was a bit of regret, actually, from some of the local communities about a bit of a missed opportunity, because there was fear about what that change would entail. And I think, I think that's an important point around the lessons learned. It's important to be able to acknowledge where we haven't got it right, and not pretend like it has all been roses, because it hasn't. And it takes a bit of vulnerability and humility to go, we didn't get that right. But in order to build trust, to get people to have another crack, you do need to acknowledge where things have gone wrong, but also look at where is it working well, and how can we try to maximise those benefits or opportunities at a local scale. But the key thing that happens there is trust building to make them participate in that. But I think some really important insights there, and including that thing about the money. It's not something that I think we openly talk about, but it does have an impact on people's sense of fairness. Like, is it either where are my taxpayer dollars going, or who's benefiting from this? Where's the dollars going? What, insert company that doesn't sound local name here. And, that does actually have an impact on how people feel about the change that's happening around it. And so how do we help to shift that to, maximising those local benefits and opportunities where possible? Phil, Liz, I'm going to ask you the same thing. Like, what does meaningful participation look like in practice?
Yeah, it's interesting one. Just touching on the money and expectations there. That's it is interesting when and to pick up on your point, Kate, around just the learnings and sort of where we're at with various plans around sharing the benefits of projects and those sorts of things, and some of the views around figures associated with that are really interesting. But I would just say that there is a very different it's a very different story between a landholder who is hosting something and one that is looking at something from a distance, and we need to be mindful of that. But I think just some of the key takeaways from me is, I think if you can limit surprises as much as you can and manage expectations, that's probably a big one for me. So, making it clear to community and, and this is very much through a developer lens, but, making it clear what's available to be influenced and what's not. Often it's often it might be pack up and go away, we don't want you. And it's like, oh, but we'd like to stick around and continue our project. And, that's not the consultation outcome that the other party might not have wanted. But so making that really clear, I think, is important. Obviously, you got a role to explain, and you got a role to explain the specifics of your project. And now, with, I think, government taking more active role in some of the strategic stuff, they're going to jump back in and start talking policy and objectives and some of those sorts of things. But you'll still have to probably do a little bit from that. You will get lots of local information that will help your project if you listen. And that is, your map's wrong there. This paddock is always underwater when it's rains. I hear that all the time. Where certain birds are nesting, all of those sorts of things. It's really important, all of that sort of information. There might be concerns of the local CFA brigade. All of that stuff is important, as well as importantly now when you in the sort of this environment when thankfully we are doing a lot of work around community benefits and sharing and trying to deal with some of the inequities. Getting an understanding of what community needs are. That's critical. So they're things, but I think just learnings over the years, small little basic things that go wrong can set a really bad tone, even if it's just the not getting back to people or not following up on something that you did. And some of those little basic 1%ers are an issue. Obviously, you got to embed engagement into your project as a whole, and you've got to resource it effectively as well. So that's key. And I think you hear a lot from and I've almost sort of stopped going to conferences now, because there'll always be someone that looks over the top of the glasses and they'll tell the audience that you just got to go and consult more and consult earlier. And it's just like, thanks for that contribution, but consulting too early can also be quite problematic as well if you don't have clear information. And we've seen that with engagement processes that go out with blobs, where, say, a power line easement could be anywhere in a blob the size of a third of a state. Then I think that's where we need to look at some of those processes. Is that the best way? Because you're creating unnecessary concern with more people. And yes, I think how we think through some of that. But as was raised before, just learning from the mistakes. Learning from things that until things have popped up, you just might not know they're an issue. So if you can learn from something that happened 15 years ago, you should. So good examples where you've got, a couple of wind farms that are trying to buy road base and concrete products, say at the same time that the local shire wants to buy those as well, and then there's an issue around price and everything. So if you're sort of engaging on some of these issues, then or you've learnt from these in the past, so you know that you can apply that and ask those sorts of questions as you develop your projects. That's the sort of learning that's really important, as well as just being flexible with your processes and adapting as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Phil. And I think, yeah, just on that point, like it's not one size fits all, and what might be a really solid engagement process or method in one area may not necessarily achieve that outcome in another. And that comes down to that learning from what's happened before, but also what you say, listening to those there about their experiences and their fears and their aspirations as well. Liz, before we go to our audience questions, I'll just ask you that question of, what does meaningful participation look like from your experiences?
One of my main things is outcomes. So I think meaningful engagement needs to result in meaningful outcomes. But what meaningful outcomes can mean can vary across different contexts. So, for example, I was quite involved with the transition on Minjerribah from it being a mining site to a national park. And the national park was to be co-managed, and so with the First Nation people, the Quandamooka. And so I had to do a lot of talking to Quandamooka people as a part of my role. And for one elder in particular, it was just sitting down and actually listening to stories that she had about her mother and what had happened to her mother at a particular location. Now, the outcome of that was that I heard her story. It didn't actually lead to any specific outcome in terms of where maps were being drawn and things like that. So understanding that, but also it can go from something that's really about we need to be heard all the way through to we actually need to see some things, and understanding that an outcome is critical if you don't want to get consultation fatigue or engagement fatigue. Because the thing that annoys people the most is, you've come around before and you've had a good chat to us and nothing ever changes, and we don't see you absorbing any of our knowledge. So we've told you about that paddock that's always underwater, and we notice that it keeps popping up in the plans as a prospective area to put a power line or something. It's just not going to work, and we keep telling you that and you don't listen. And so they can be very small things and they can be very big things, but people need to see that there is an outcome. And the outcome might also be saying, well, we've heard you, but we need to acknowledge that we can't do that as well, and being willing to own that as well. So I think moving all the way through to, it's the listening component of it, through to actually doing listening, hearing, and then translating that into something that's tangible. It can be a yes, it can be a no, it can be a maybe, but it has to be something that is sort of said back to the community. Otherwise, it's just another lot of people going bloody, 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 and now we're going to tell you all about ourselves and pretend to listen to what you're saying. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of communities find difficult. And I have to admit that I've been in some kind of unique situations with doing engagement, and it would be very rare to say that if you actually sit down and you listen to the person, that you come out bad. You can be in fundamental disagreement, but if someone's telling you something and you're genuinely listening to it and you engage with it and you have the respect to listen properly to their views, then it doesn't go down that funny thing that so often happens in terms of some of this stuff. So outcomes.
Yeah, they were really, really, really well put, Liz, there. I think there's some real nuggets in what you've said, and the constant theme of hearing back is about listening. Listening is key, but then do something with that. And if it's, this is why we couldn't do something with that, or this is how we've done something with that, it helps to build that platform to keep having conversations, build trust, and actually see outcomes. Thank you so much. We've got some questions, a question on the chat, and I'll just encourage anyone else who's online. I think a few people have to drop off at 3, but please, if you have any questions for our wonderful panel, pop them in the chat. But Liz, I have a question for you. sort of going back to our first point of topic around fairness, but what could regional and state government contribution to fair processes and outcomes look like?
That is not a straightforward question. But I think it's like I almost want to revert to my my background as political science, and I think the Constitution is really important, so I apologise for framing it a little bit like this. But state governments have the pivotal role in terms of service delivery in Australia, and that role can be devolved down to local governments if resourced effectively, but it's the responsibility of state governments to deliver. And so fairness is actually, I think, state governments accepting that responsibility and taking it really seriously and saying, if we need to go to the Commonwealth, then we go to the Commonwealth to ask for their help and all that sort of stuff. And that seems to work really well when you have a natural disaster and not very well at any other time. But it's almost like, in fact, I quite often just go, why are these things in a natural disaster context so easy for the politics to fall away and for the public good to emerge as the key focus? Sometimes not quite so much, but typically that's when the governments are at their best and the leaders are at their best. Which probably takes me to that second point, is that I want to see more leadership from our governments. I want them to articulate what it is that they stand for in this space and explain to me how they plan to deliver it and where the challenges are and how they then want to work with communities at a regional level to achieve those things. And I don't want them to be shy about the fact that, yes, I might be elected in the Brisbane suburb, but my responsibility is for the whole of Queensland, and therefore I will go and talk to you about what that vision looks like in a regional area of Queensland, for example, that is going to be going through the energy transformation. That leadership is, I think, really leading. And I think the climate wars that we had, which, you know, a lot of them focused on people losing because they were willing to say something. Doesn't mean saying something is any less valuable. It just means the politics is more contested. But that's when you need leadership more, not less. And so I guess seeing that leadership at the state level would be something that would make me very happy. And I think I've watched attempts at it, but I'm not sure that anyone's cracked that nut yet. But respecting how big a challenge it is, but still being willing to sort of stand up in that context. Like for me, I think that would be something that would make a really significant difference at multiple levels. And then to see the state leaders actually working together. But hey, let's only ask for one thing at a time.
So what you'd like to do is just, if we take the politics out of politics, that would help.
Well, the politics does come out of politics in some things. So,
Yeah.
you know, like I often do let's think of an example where something that could be contested isn't. And I think the management of road safety, it becomes a political thing every now and then, but essentially all politicians accept that it is their responsibility through their transport departments to deliver safe roads. And when they're not safe, people, that's not contested. You don't see, you know, a leader of an opposition challenging on that basis. And so while there might be all sorts of challenges around hospital resourcing, the idea that our hospitals should be able to reliably provide free care to people when they need it is not contested in Australia either. And I think that the contest is a deliberate thing. They're looking for the division, whereas obviously I'm not in state government anymore and there might be some reasons for that, but I would like to see areas where there is generally agreement, like the willingness to stand up, and that's the leadership thing as well. So don't go, this is an opportunity for us to create division and maybe get a few more votes. Go, this is a public good. Let's not debate this one. Let's go, let's agree.
Yep. Thank you. Are there any more questions from our participants for... I might just give you a few more moments, but I'm just going to ask each of you just a real quick 1-2 sentence answer. What gives you optimism about the current engagement practice in the energy transition? Who wants to go first? Oh, I'll have to
Yeah.
point.
Oh,
Kate, can you
Had
go?
to have
You go,
that.
Phil. You go, Phil. You're right.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, look, I think just what I touched on before is the just that this is all timing, and Kane Thornton from Clean Energy Council always used to said that you're sort of going from here to here, but we're bumping all around the place, and there's ups and downs across the way. I mean, I really get frustrated with all of those political discussions. I'm always like, why do we have to choose this topic? Add climate to it as well, and that be the one that we just at each other's throats about. That has always just distressed me, and there's a simple answer, and that's you sort of follow the money and you look at the donors. But I think where I'm optimistic is that, as I said, the physics and the economics in terms of how much electricity you can produce with essentially zero marginal cost. I mean, that says everything. So it's all in the how and how we maximise, not in the if. So a little bit of the when, but not an if. So that's the main thing for me. But so how we sort of. So I'm optimistic in terms of that, and I'm optimistic with where a lot of the thinking's going in terms of sharing the benefits from transition and from projects. Sure, there's still a lot of tick the box thinking out of there, but there's also some innovative approaches being in the mix as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Phil. What about you, Kate? What gives you optimism about current engagement?
Yeah, well,
this transition.
It's kind of working. If you look at, if you go from and this is one of my own personal things that I believe in, think global, act local. So globally, we need to look after the planet for the future. We need to limit the impacts of climate change. That's what the science says, the physics, like you say, Phil. And, we can be really proud that, in the quarter at the end of last year was the first time we had, our electricity market delivered more than 50% out of renewables, so we're getting there. That's the first time ever that's happened. So, we are transforming and transitioning into a cleaner future, which is great for all of us for whatever view we have. I definitely have optimism around government. You would have seen me smile when Phil said, government's just turning up. But we did get changes to legislation last year, so that was good. We are seeing foreign investment. We're seeing local investment. We're definitely seeing interest in industry around some of these skill sets coming into the energy transformation from other parts of better industry, government, schooling, education. So, and I was, you mentioned Kane, Phil, I met up with Jackie Trad recently, the new CEO of the Clean Energy Council, and we were talking about the fact that, it's all happening. We're on the way, and we can talk about the things that, maybe are getting in the way, but there's lots that are happening, and we're moving forward. And those that are working in this industry and contributing are seeing that. But I think there's real opportunity for us to share, as we said earlier, that some of the good news stories about where things are happening well, not shying away from the fact that we can always do better. But look, I think the optimism around we're doing the right thing.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. Please.
My optimism is a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, but for the first time in history, I genuinely believe that we now have to think better about how we use our resources more wisely. So the energy transition is part of that. The climate challenge is part of that. Population growth is part of that. But one of the things that's driving us to is recognizing that old forms of knowledge might be able to solve those sorts of questions better than, contemporary economics. And so it's allowing us to see the value of First Nations, and it's not just in Australia, it's elsewhere, and their deep wisdom in terms of how they view resources and how they view science and how they view a whole lot of things. And so part of my optimism comes is that in times of, significant challenge and change, we're much more open to different ways of viewing things, and that may well actually enable us to better recognise the contribution that understanding country, for example, can bring to these conversations. And that's just one small part of it. And so why it's a double-edged sword is that it's happening because we're not using the resources wisely enough at this point, and there are all sorts of challenges. But at the same time, I genuinely believe there's this massive potential then to see a shift in terms of whose wisdom and knowledge gets to be seen as legitimate. And so it will broaden the way that we think rather than narrow it down. And that's probably my optimism and my great hope, is that that's something that we do and that we advocate for and that we enable through this process, rather than, constantly shutting it down and marginalising and saying, well, that would be great, but. So that's mine.
Well, thank you all. I think there's some really good things to take from that, and I think you're right. Yeah, as I said, in the last couple of decades, we have had real change and progress, and what's also changed is the way communities participate in this process, whether it's from putting solar on your rooftop to being more conscientious participants in the conversation around energy, whether that it might be from a position of full support or a position of I'm not really sure what this means for me, or a position of fear, but community has a voice and is keen to use it, and it's sort of our job to kind of go, well, how do we make sure that we really understand, listen, and facilitate that voice in our processes. And I think there's a lot of interest and good examples of where that's happening, and there's also still some work to do. But I'm really thankful for the three of you for coming along today and sharing your insights. This really was a conversation. There wasn't, as I said, we had a bit of a question at the start, but you've been very generous in just following the chat and sharing your opinions and insights as well. So thank you to the three of you. And thank you to those that have come along. We are, as I said, this is the first of 6 sessions that are happening over the course of the week. And I'll just, for those that are still online, just share what those are in case you're interested to join. So tomorrow we've got a session on local leadership, touching on one of the themes we discussed today, and that's looking at the role of councils in the energy transition. So you can hear some lessons from regional councils and explore how collaboration between local, state and industry pastors can help drive positive outcomes, which, as I said, is sort of building off some of the themes we discussed today. We then have on Wednesday a session on lessons from the field, looking at what's working in renewable energy community benefits, both sharing some practical examples of where it's happened and looking at what more can we do to maximise community benefits in the energy transition. Then we also have a session on Indigenous leadership in the energy transition on Wednesday, which is hearing from some really excellent leaders and practitioners in this space to looking at pathways for governance and community benefits in renewable energy projects, and the role of Indigenous leadership and the role of all of us in supporting that in our projects. And then we have another session on powering the land, agriculture and energy. A super important part of this transition and this conversation and this discussion explores how farming, land stewardship, energy infrastructure can coexist and deliver shared benefits for landowners and communities as well. And then finally, this is a more practical workshop-based session where we're really hoping that many of you can join us for this interactive workshop, which is looking to co-design ideas and approaches that can help strengthen engagement in the renewable energy transition. So we are hoping to wrap up the series with some of the things we've heard, the things we've learned, the things we've considered, and shaping that up into a practical ideas that we can perhaps take forward with us in our work. So thanks again to all of those who have joined this first session. Thanks again to Kate, Liz and Phil and everyone that's online. We look forward to seeing you in some of the other sessions as the week progresses. Thanks very much.